Welcome back to Bruised Not Broken, Life with Glanzmann's Thrombasthenia. For those of you just joining us, Glanzmann's Thrombasthenia is an extremely rare autosomal recessive disorder of the blood, in which the platelets lack glycoprotein 2b3a. Hence, no clotting can occur and bleeding time is significantly prolonged. GT can be life-threatening and is estimated to affect 1 in every 1 million. This podcast is presented by the Glanzmann's Research Foundation. My name's Taylor, and I'm your host. And as always, I'm joined by Peter. Today, we are joined by Luke Pembroke. Luke is the Director of Community Engagement for Haemnet. It's a specialist research and communications consultancy working in the bleeding disorder community. Luke is uniquely qualified for his position with Haemnet because, well, Luke is a hemophiliac. Peter and I met Luke almost a year ago when he and Dr. Khair approached us about joining them on their podcast, Haemcast, and discussing Glanzmann's. Luke's personal journey immediately inspired and intrigued us, and we knew we needed to find a way to introduce him to our GT community. So without further ado, Luke, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. And wow, flawless introduction there. Honestly, I have to go back and re-record mine on our podcast all the time, but that was something. You're a natural.
Thank you. I worked hard on this, and I have a script now so that I don't go too off key.
It's all in the prep work.
Absolutely. Well, Luke, how are you doing? You know, the last that the three of us spoke, well, we spoke to Kate as well. Y'all were preparing to attend the EAHAD, which first off, what is that?
So it's the European Allied Health. I can't remember the thing off the top of my head.
With the first question.
Yeah, so basically, everyone just refers to it as EHAD. So you're like, You're going to EHAD this year. And I can't remember what the exact acronym off the top of my head is. But essentially, it's a primarily healthcare professional conference for people in Europe who specialize in hemophilia and bleeding disorders. And to be fair, they also have a fair few clinicians from the States and other parts of the world attend. It really has sort of grown in reach over a number of years, but it's sort of high science and the latest developments in bleeding disorders. Research are presented through various sessions and symposia, and then they have a big hall of posters and abstracts that people submit. And when we attended this year, we had a poster up and presented the data from the Glanzmann's 360 study that we, as you mentioned, sort of been going on nearly a year now in terms of when we first got it all started. And then Khair, who works with me, was also presenting information about the study in the nurses pre-conference day as well. So they had a lot of nurses attend there who had a specialist interest in sort of ultra-rare bleeding disorders.
That's really cool. And especially, I guess the thing, I don't know if that would be similar to like the Hemophilia's bleeding disorder conference. Sounds like it's a little bit more like focused on the research aspect of it, which that's always exciting. I nerd out over some of that science. I may not understand it, but Google is my friend.
Yeah, the stuff they present is very high science. I mean, even a lot of the doctors and researchers there will be the first people to jump on Twitter and go, this presentation I was just in was amazing, but wow, it's complicated. So when you actually see the scientists and researchers admitting it's difficult, I'm very happy if I understand at least sort of like 20-30% of the content, because some of it is really high science. And I sat through some of the platelet disorder and von Willebrand stuff, and that's when the science gets super complicated. I always say hemophilia is so simple when you compare it to all these other bleeding disorders. Like, us hemophiliacs are basic.
Well, I will say one thing that Peter and I look for anytime that we speak with someone from the bleeding disorder world is their passion. Are they passionate about their work? Do they truly want to see change? We try not to be jaded or cynical when we meet with new people. But after doing this for 3 years, we do maintain a certain level of wariness. I will say, you and Kate kind of broke through that immediately. You listened, you cared, and it just really, it's not something that we necessarily come across on a regular basis when we talk to people or when people ask us about GT. What feeds your drive to make a change in the bleeding disorder world?
So I think even before I got involved in Haemnet to begin with, it was very much sort of a humble beginning situation. Kate, as a specialist nurse in bleeding disorders, practiced at Great Ormond Street, had seen patients and families with every bleeding disorder you could imagine. And she was attending a nurse roundtable where our current CEO, Mike, was working as a freelance medical writer at the time. And Mike immediately noticed Kate's passion and drive and the way she would be very comfortable in kind of calling things out and really sort of upsetting the apple cart and saying what needs to be done better. And I think Mike sort of was immediately attracted to that energy Kate brought. And then from there, they started on this path of setting up Haemnet, which primarily was a sort of community platform to encourage nurses and other allied healthcare professionals to network, share experience. And then from there, a lot of the research grants that Haemnet managed to secure involved a lot of patient perspective, and the qualitative research side brought in these patient perspectives. And we realized that there was so much data and nuance out there in all of these stories that people had about growing up with a bleeding disorder that we realized were really important to uncover and tell those stories through doing research and collecting the data. And I think that's really what drives us, is that we know things can be better for everyone with a bleeding disorder. We honestly believe that. And with all these treatment developments that have gone on in recent years, I think we all recognize that there is that risk that the gap continues to get bigger. Hemophilia, for the small percentage in the developed world who get access to good treatments, are doing well and things are positive and things can still do better. But then there's all these other subsets of this wider bleeding disorders population that maybe sort of get left behind or left in the shadows a bit. And we really feel strongly about shining a light on these other areas of the community, and that if things improve, they have got to improve for everyone together. And it shouldn't be that sort of one group of the community gets it better than others, whether it's women with bleeding disorders, those people with ultra rare bleeding disorders, the priority should be just as high for them as it is for the plain old hemophiliacs like me, if you like.
I mean, your patient-centric attitude, honestly, it's not something that's seen very often, especially in companies who do these surveys for pharmaceutical companies or even just for research in general. The Glanzmann's 360 survey is very unique. I love it. I went through it. I made my sister go through it and fill it out and everything, because I was like, I think these are really good questions. Peter, I think you've taken it as well.
Yep.
And just explain the survey and the thought process behind the questions, I guess.
I guess the biggest challenge to start with was Glanzmann's being a fairly unrecognized disorder, and there not really being much out there in terms of publications and knowledge in the scientific community because of how rare it is, and therefore it maybe doesn't get the attention from companies, investors, that sort of thing. So when we were approached by HEMAB about conducting this natural history study, we immediately were like, yes, this is something we'd really love to do, and it's in a area of bleeding disorders that is pretty underserved. And there was so much we wanted to know. And it was that kind of balance of like, well, we need to do a survey to collect as much data as possible, but we can't make a survey that's going to take people ages. Like, I know as someone who's done surveys on hemophilia for years, like if you don't get it right and you ask too much, people switch off, you don't get the completion rates, and ultimately that kind of weakens your data. So we often try and structure this where we have a survey where we try and collect some sort of more top-line data that really sort of gives an idea of how people are impacted on a daily basis by their condition. And then we, within the survey, give people the opportunity to opt into a more in-depth interview where Kate or one of our other colleagues, Simon, the other research nurse, will do those interviews with them to really get into the nitty-gritty of what it's like to live with a certain bleeding disorder such as Glanzmann's. So the survey really sort of is kind of top line stuff, but we kind of pulled together different tools that exist out there, particularly for hemophilia in terms of like EQ5D or Hemoqual, and pulled bits and pieces from those to see how we could sort of adapt those to better understanding Glanzmann's, for example, because we recognize it is still a rare bleeding disorder. There might be some similarities and overlap in terms of how it impacts people, how hemophilia or von Willebrand's does, but also recognizing that some things are going to be different. I think that initial thing that really stood out for us is the sort of regular frequency of external bleeding that people with Glanzmann's just sort of put up with on a weekly basis. And the kind of attitude really just seemed like, well, it is what it is. We just have to deal with it and get on with it. And I think in hemophilia, we're always told, like a nosebleed or a cut or something is like, treat it, basic first aid. And that's assuming that someone with hemophilia is on prophylaxis factors. So those sort of little external bleeds don't cause them a problem. Whereas people with Glanzmann's, it's like, no, this is actually a huge impact on people's day to day. But there is this thing with the disability paradox where you just kind of normalize something that is abnormal. And it's just really shocking to see, wow, like people are just having to deal with this and put up with this. And it's something that's definitely not given as much recognition as it should be. Because ultimately, if you're having a nosebleed that lasts for hours and it's impacting going to school or working, that isn't normal and something needs to be done about it. So even though we can say, and it might seem obvious to you guys in the Glanzmann's community, like, yeah, of course this stuff is going on, it's important that we capture those insights and that data and actually put it out there into the world and go, look, this is a problem and we need to pay attention to it, because there are people out there dealing with things that they really shouldn't have to be going through on such a severe level.
Yeah. I mean, I can guarantee you that GT patients aren't telling their doctors every bleed that they have. They're probably not even recording every bleed that they have. Just knowing the people that I know who I talk to on a regular basis, because like you said, if it's not creating a problem in that moment, then it's just a normal day in their lives. It's only when it gets to the point where they're like, oh, well, okay, maybe this nosebleed is a little too extreme. Maybe I do need to go to the doctor. That's kind of when, that's when the medical intervention happens, which there's nothing wrong with that, being able to take care of a bleed on your own at home. But when doctors aren't hearing about it, like you said, then they don't know about it. And there just ends up being this gap. They don't realize how much it truly is impacting them every day. So 10 years ago, would you have seen yourself in this spot right now as the communications director of a research and communications consultancy firm for bleeding disorders?
No, I mean, I never really thought I'd end up working within the hemophilia and bleeding disorder space. Like, I mean, living with it 24/7, right? You'd think it's enough. I did biology at university because the hemophilia and science side of it really did interest me, but I was more into sort of like natural history and wildlife conservation, that sort of thing. And went off to university and then very quickly realized that without a sort of a bank of mum and dad fallback plan and not much time to sort of go around doing a bunch of voluntary stuff, that, okay, I need to get a job. And I was pretty good at the biotech side of things and writing scientific stuff. So I got a job in healthcare communications it was like my first grad job in London, and worked across loads of different disease spaces. And then had an opportunity to go freelance. That's when I ended up getting a chance to work for Haemnet in a freelance capacity. And then as we grew, they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And I joined up with Haemnet full time because the work they were doing felt really important to me. It was something I was genuinely very passionate about. And both Mike and Kate treated me as an expert in my own right and not the sort of like token patient. Like, oh, he's person with hemophilia, he's helpful to have around. It's kind of like they see me as everything but a person with hemophilia, and that kind of comes last. But that obviously is helpful in terms of helping me sort of relate to what's going on in the community. And yeah, I didn't expect to sort of be living and work all things bleeding disorders and hemophilia. And people do, my friends ask, like, doesn't it drive you crazy? Isn't it too much? And I was like, yeah, it does at times. But the job that I had before drove me crazy as well. And I was like, at least I can really be working in something I'm passionate about in a community that I really care about. It kind of makes dealing with the stressful, crazy side of it all worth it. And, the opportunity to meet so many people in the community and work on some really cool projects and be able to go to all these conferences and hear about really cool nerdy science, which I already liked, it's a bit of a treat. And yeah, it does make me kind of chuckle that I've ended up being the heading up community engagement for Haemnet, because I think anyone who knows me quite well will say that I'm more of a classic introvert than someone super extroverted, which for community engagement doesn't kind of make sense. But I think that kind of helps because I'm one of those people who very much would rather kind of sit back and listen to other people share their stories and expert insights rather than kind of like dominate the conversation all the time, which I think definitely helps in the role that I have now. And yeah, so usually I'm not the one talking on podcasts. I'm sort of sat there silently in the background helping Kate, produce them, and then I sit there and edit away. So I think that's what I prefer. It's nice to be a fly on the wall.
Oh yeah, I work with someone very similar to that, and yet he still says nothing. He's the man behind the curtain. Well, okay, so then this leads straight into my next question. Your area of expertise is communications and social media, and instead of just being the man behind the camera or behind the keyboard, you do step out of that every once in a while. And you, like, just looking through like your YouTube and looking through articles and stuff like that, you kind of lay it all out there for everyone. I guess my question is, because you include people in as much of your journey as you can, which is awesome. But it can also, especially with this day and age of social media and everything, how do you achieve letting people in, being vulnerable, but also still maintaining a semblance of privacy, I guess?
That's a really good question. It's tricky, and it's something I genuinely have struggled with. And I mean, I don't make videos publicly sharing a lot as often as I did, because it did become very draining. And for example, I had to come off of Facebook because I'd get a message every day from either, a mum of someone with hemophilia asking for medical advice and, really worrying stuff. And all I could do is be like, call your center, call your hemophilia center. Like, I'm not a doctor, don't ask me. And then people from the developing world just asking if I could get treatment to them. And, obviously it's not really something I'm able to do. And so that sort of thing is tough. And trying to strike that balance can be really tricky. But I think, it's helpful, and I've had some really positive comments from people with hemophilia and carers, parents who said that they found my videos and they've really helped them. So that's kind of what makes it worthwhile for me to do. And yeah, but it isn't easy. You do have to find that balance, and I think it's kind of giving yourself permission to share what you're willing to share and set your own boundaries. And if people are hounding after you after certain bits of information and data, like, just switch off from it and be comfortable in sharing what you want to share. So the big example for that is I made the conscious decision, and I discussed it with my hemophilia team prior to actually receiving gene therapy, that I wanted to document it as a kind of personal exercise more than anything. But I felt that there was this kind of iron curtain up between the community and then those going through the trials of gene therapy. And I kind of wanted to tear that down a little bit and, show how the sausage was being made, if you like. And I said to my team, within the first year, I fully intend to avoid mentioning what my levels were, because in the context of gene therapy in the first year of the trial, what my levels would be week to week is wholly irrelevant, and it's not really useful information for the patient community to have at that point. I'm one person. I'm in the first year where the variability can be up and down. And so I made a decision that, I wasn't going to reveal that data until I at least hit the year mark. But every week or every time I put a new post out, it was just comments and private messages from people like, what are your levels? What's going on? And, they wanted every nitty gritty piece of detail. And I just kind of had to say, look, like, I'm not willing to disclose that. That's kind of personal information for me right now. And I have my reasons for not sharing it, for the benefit of myself, but also for the community. And I was like, but if you are interested, like, comment, like, subscribe, and maybe you'll find out in a year's time. But, there are people where if you put yourself out there a bit, they kind of then expect everything from you. And, if you're then not very sort of free with handing out all the information about yourself, people are kind of like, well, why not? And it's, there are some things that you just want to keep to yourself. And, that's why I kind of took a bit of a step back and a break from making videos as often, because I found it, quite exhausting in a lot of ways. And also having to, like, listen back to your own voice and edit it also drives you mad as well.
Well, so this is going to be a dual question for both of you.
Uh-oh.
Brace yourself, Peter.
So we're kind of in a weird spot now with, and this is still on the vein of social media. And I know Peter's like, oh, where's she going with this? My generation, millennials, we grew up with the internet, right? Like not throughout our whole lives, but definitely, to the point where we felt comfortable, we overshare, all of that, right? Well, now millennials are having kids. Some of those kids have these bleeding disorders or have these rare bleeding disorders or, going through any of this type of stuff. And so that aspect of sharing on social media doesn't necessarily switch off. And then these kids aren't grown yet, so they can't tell us, the effects that this is having or anything. But with your own personal experiences with social media, with both of y'all having, I guess, both of y'all being patient advocates and being approached and having control now over what you share with the world and everything, what do you think, like, I guess not necessarily put yourself in their shoes, but what do you think when you see this, when someone's journey is being shared so in detail and that they're not at the capacity where that they can give permission for that or not?
Yeah, it's a slippery slope. Like I've seen stuff over the years that's really quite concerning in terms of just the level of detail that some parents go to in terms of sharing everything about what their kid is going through. And of course, that's a weird one because, like you say, the child doesn't really have the capacity to sort of consent to that. And I think there are some things that need to be private. I also do see the benefits to it. I think it does help for other parents and other children to see people like them. And I think because of social media, the visibility of other people who might have something like you is a lot more frequent. So you always hear people with bleeding disorders, like 10, 20, 30 years ago, didn't really know anyone else growing up with it and wouldn't really come across anyone else. And, when they finally did, everyone always talks about it being a, really cathartic and beneficial experience. I think with social media, you kind of give people an opportunity to go, look, there are other people like you, you aren't alone. But then it is that slippery slope where it's like, well, are you showing too much? Like examples where I've seen like parents showing like the gruesome details of every bleed their child is having on social media. And I'm like, oh, maybe a bit much, right? Like you kind of are reliant on people kind of self-calibrating and some people do it better than others, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's very reactionary in how they post in really intense moments. And then maybe if they took a beat and in a couple of weeks' time, they're actually like, oh, maybe I should have like held back a bit there.
Yes, this is something that's so close to my heart because, and I think I've told you this before, Luke, it's my little sister who has Glanzmann's. And my mom was who founded the Glanzmann's Research Foundation. In that effort, it was, okay, my sister became the face of it the whole time growing up. And so I've kind of watched it as a sibling, not as a parent. So, right, like it's a different perspective when you're watching your sibling go through it. And it's hard because that parent is doing what they think is best. That there's absolute every great intention to it. But I also feel like there's also a fallout to it because not having any sense of personal privacy, you're eventually going to pay a cost for that, whether it be, that person no longer feels comfortable talking about their disorder at all, or, they just kind of shut away the outside world or they go into denial or anything like that. Peter, I mean, what do you think about it?
It's hard to not go with the 50-50 approach. I'm trying to pick something a little bit more definite. I think there has to be an age limit, and I don't know what that age limit is, but it needs to be the point where you're actually asking them if they want to be online, and they need to be able to understand that there's a lot of people that's going to be able to see this.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think that's good to put it in perspective that, I mean, it's online. Anybody can access it, basically.
Yeah. I've seen like some of my favorite YouTubers I follow who've, gone on to have children. have made very conscious decisions to like never show their children's face in their vlogs or whatever. And they sort of edit it very cleverly where you can't see them. And, you know, they say, you know, once they're at an age where I can ask them, do you want to be in this video, and actually explain to them what that means, for them to, you know, have the autonomy and say, yeah, I'm okay with it. But until that point, they're kind of like, I'm not going to reveal my, you know, children's face all over social media if I've got a public profile, which I totally get and I'm totally behind. And, you know, I think if when it comes to a health condition, if you're sort of like bearing this child's soul in terms of every detail about what it's like for them to live with this condition, you know, all of a sudden they grow up and they're just kind of like, well, none of my life has felt like it's been private, and they haven't really had control over their story. And like you say, that could then lead to them shutting down completely. And, you know, even from my like older perspective, when I first started making videos, I was really into it. And then it, you know, once you start doing that and people expect more of you, it does become quite intense, and getting invited to talks all the time. And eventually I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to end up being like Mr. Hemophilia, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It is draining. And I've had other people out there who are very, you know, public and vocal about their story over the years. And they've all said the same thing. Like, I don't want to end up being like Mr. Hemophilia, because I don't know, it's not really a label that I think people want to be recognized for all the other things that they do and bring to the world, rather than just like, oh, my blood doesn't work. Like, there is more to me, you know, which it sounds ironic because my friends, like when I was at school, like all my nicknames were like hemophilia related, but I really sort of lent into it because that kind of dark humor side of things was a coping mechanism for me. It like helped me get through tough times. If, you know, I let my friends call me thin blood or hemo or whatever. And, you know, it seems weird that I'm like, oh yeah, I don't want to be defined by my hemophilia. But then on the back of my leavers hoodie when I finished school, it said hemo. And it was like, can't have it both ways, Luke. But, you know, it's the way I found a balance, I guess.
No, I get that. Especially, you know, my sister used to be like, she used to always throw it back at us that, you know, she could bruise easily or anything like that. Especially like, and that, I'm going to let you know right now, is unfair in sibling rivalry type deals. Like when you're fighting and your sibling can be like, oh yeah, well, you can't touch me right now. Like, I'm a bruise. Or I'm going to tell mom, you see this bruise here? I'm going to tell mom you did that. Like, yeah.
My brother didn't care. He would just straight up be like, oh, I'm going to give you a bruise. Don't be careful. We'd be on the trampoline doing all the WWE moves. My mum would come running up the garden like, no, what are you doing? You're going to have a bleed. I was like, yeah, but we just learnt this cool new move. And my brother, you know, credit to him, you know, despite, you know, being unaffected, he was very good at sort of just treating me like normal. Which, you know, he's younger than me, but I think as it goes for sort of like hemophilia siblings, he was very mature about it when I actually reflect on it.
Well, so let's dive into, get away from the controversial part of this. Let's talk about your gene therapy journey. So you had your infusion in February of 2020. Were you approached? Did you find the clinical trial? How did that conversation even begin?
So it first came to my knowledge, the trial, when I was in for one of my biannual visits at my haemophilia center. And I went in and I actually saw my doctor very quickly, which was, you know, kind of a rarity. And then it became clear why. I was like, oh, we have this trial that's recruiting at the moment. You know, here's some more information. Would you be interested? And I was like, you know, I'm curious. They told me that other people, you know, the first cohort had already been dosed and that, you know, it was looking promising. And would I be, you know, open to getting involved? And I mean, as a first step, I had to even see if I was eligible to take part by screening for the neutralizing antibodies against the vector they use to deliver the gene therapy. So my mindset was kind of like, well, it can't hurt to know, right? Like if I find out if I'm not eligible, then at least I can clear it out of my mind. So I did the blood test and it came back that I would be suitable to take part. And that gave me a lot to think about. And so I went away over a couple of weeks before I came back into the center and ultimately said at that point, that would have been in 2018, that I just couldn't really commit to it because I had so much planned in the diary for work, travels, personal stuff throughout 2019, and that, you know, it wasn't the right time for me, maybe something to revisit in the future. And then roll roll round to the end of 2019, the conversation came up again. And in my head, I'm like, oh, okay, they're really, desperate for recruitment numbers. That's how trials work. Like, I'm not silly to that when you're being approached about taking part in a trial. Obviously it's a unique opportunity and it could be really, life-changing. But at the same time, like, these treatment centers do have recruitment targets to meet, right? Like, they do need trial participants. So it was always bearing that in mind that I kind of had the power, I guess, like the ball was in my court, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I went through all the blood screening again because it had been a year. So we needed to make sure I hadn't developed those antibodies in that time, and spoke to the hemophilia center that would actually be doing the dosing and the team there. And then decided that, okay, yeah, I'm actually going to go for this. I've made the decision. I've given it a lot of thought. I've spoken to people in my life. I discussed it at work to make sure it would actually be practical and doable. And looked at 2020 and was like, yeah, I can make this work. Plan everything around it. And try and, fit the trial into normal everyday life as much as possible. And so, I was dosed in February of 2020. And then as part of the trial, I went on to high doses of steroids to suppress my immune system to give the gene therapy the best chance of taking. And then I think we all know what happened in 2020. And so any sort of planning or ideas I had about what was going to happen all went out the window because the pandemic just sent everything into absolute chaos. And so it was a very unique clinical trial experience, to say the least, because when you're on high doses of immunosuppression in a global pandemic, everyone starts getting a little bit panicky. So
Yes, I can only imagine. Well, okay, so you made an amazing video for the 2021 Rare Reach Festival. That's what I saw on YouTube, and we're going to share it in the show notes because I honestly think that it's great. Our researchers, Dr. Wilcox and everything, he's working on gene therapy. And so having you be able to share your experience and be on this podcast today, honestly, I feel like it's shining a light on something that's been talked about for so long within our community, but is such a big unknown. So when you start to kind of answer those questions as to what it's like and everything, it makes your comfort level a little bit better, right? It makes you not as panicky. But there were two things that really stood out to me in this video. And it was when you talked about when you were going in and for your infusion and how you couldn't necessarily say that you were scared, but you also couldn't say you're excited, that it was like taking a test, like a college test. Like you just kind of had this pit in your stomach, like of nerves, basically.
Yeah.
And then you talked about how when you were on the immunosuppressants, you were by yourself and everything, and how you had every side effect possible. Like anything that they listed that you could potentially have, you had it, right? The migraines, the being sick, all of that. And you explained how living with hemophilia, yes, you're living with something on a day-to-day basis, but you never thought of yourself as being sick because you weren't sick on a day-to-day basis. And that really struck me because I think so many people, especially within our community, when they watch this video, it'll ring true to them because I don't think, Peter, I mean, I don't know, I don't have GT. I don't think a lot of our community truly view themselves as being sick because, again, they're not, dealing with vomiting or anything like that on a day-to-day basis. They would never compare it to, what somebody who has cancer is going through or somebody who, something similar where it takes such a physical toll on your body. If you were to ask somebody with GT, they're like, oh, well, I just bleed. Like, I don't do that. And Peter, let me know if I'm overstepping, but
no, that sounds about it.
When you put that in perspective like that, and I don't know, it hit me. It hit a chord, and I just really liked the video.
That was to sort of summarize and give a sense of what that first year of the trial was like. And it did make me reflect on, having grown up with hemophilia and actually, for the most part, I've always, been doing okay. Like bleeds are painful and can really wipe you out, but I wasn't living with, some of these other rare conditions out there where it just seems like these, poor people are constantly unwell. And, that's not really how like hemophilia or some bleeding disorders manifest. But at the same time, I guess there are certain things that you put up with regularly that you just sort of normalize. I think of GT and, when it comes to anemia, like some people could very easily sort of have like a sort of suboptimal sort of level, like baseline of sort of mild anemia where they've just sort of got used to it and it just feels normal to them. But like if someone else suddenly, was in their shoes, they'd be like, God, I do not feel well at all. But it's just what we get used to, right? Like it is that normalization of the abnormal that I think people with bleeding disorders tend to do because we're born with these conditions. And that's the thing I say about gene therapy now is prior to the gene therapy, people would always ask, what's it like to live with hemophilia? And it was the most annoying, complicated question to answer because I was like, I don't really know what it's like to not live with it. So I can't really give you a really authentic, in-depth answer of, what is it like to live with hemophilia? How is it different to being normal? Because it was just kind of my normal. And I would always compare myself to other normal people. But I could never really kind of co-opt that experience accurately. And then since having gene therapy and being made a mild person, someone with mild hemophilia is what my phenotype would be classed as, there are, vast differences where I'm like, wow, there was a lot of stuff I had to do and put up with when I was living with severe hemophilia that I do not miss and I would hate to go back to. And I think it only having gene therapy made me realize just how much of an impact my condition did still have on me without wanting to sound like I'm ungrateful for the good care I've had and how fortunate I am to have grown up in the UK and have not been born during the contaminated blood era. Like relative to a lot of the community, I've had it pretty good. But I think there are still some serious, issues of growing up with hemophilia that have an impact on you. And it was only since I had gene therapy that I actually recognized those and gave them more credit.
So what does life look like for you post gene therapy? I mean, you've told us and now you're technically a mild hemophiliac, but like, what is that, first year like? Do you have to go in every so often? And now that you're at 3 years, what does that look like for you too?
So the first year was massively intense. In particular, those first sort of six to 9 months were very regular hospital visits. So, started off at the post-dosing, going in 3 times a week for several months. That then came down to twice a week. Then it became weekly for a couple of months, and then it went to bi-weekly. And so the gaps start getting bigger and bigger. Then by the second year, visits went down to monthly. And so I had monthly visits throughout year. Occasionally I'd have to go in an additional time for maybe some follow-up bloods or to have some scans done on my liver, whatever it may be. But my trial team were very good at trying to get all the stuff to land on the same day if possible. And because it was still kind of COVID era, a lot of people weren't able to get appointments at hospitals. So for those years, even though it was a really tough time, I actually kind of had like VIP access to the hospital, if you like. So everything was made as convenient as it could be. And then once I got past the year 2 mark, so going into 2022, that's when my visits went down to, for the trial purpose, I only needed to go in twice a year to get my levels checked and have other blood tests run. And so that's when I really sort of had the opportunity to kind of experience life post gene therapy without the trial sort of dominating day-to-day life. And so in 2022, I went away for 3 months. I did 2 months in Peru and a month in Canada. And I took some emergency treatment of factor with me, but I didn't have to use it once. It was a good job because by the time I took it out of the storage at the camp in Peru in the jungle, ants had just obliterated the whole kit. Thankfully, the factor vials were like sealed, but like all the other bits were just like completely demolished. I was like, oh dear, that's not good. But it was a nice problem to have that I just didn't have to touch my factor once. And I was, super active, long hikes, long days, and I didn't have a bleed, which is just mind boggling because I wasn't treating with factor. And so it kind of gave me a chance to road test the gene therapy, which is what I'd kind of been yearning to do, and COVID had put a lot of that on hold. So it was nice to actually get out there, put it to the test. And yeah, when I think about when I used to inject intravenously 3 times a week with factor, I used to plan so many things around my hemophilia and schedule things around treatment days and, going on a work trip or a holiday, having to account for that extra bag full of all the treatment. And all of a sudden, all these little things I just don't have to worry about. And I still now, it happens less and less as time goes on, but there are those moments where I'm having to rush out the door because I'm late for something or I'm going to meet friends at the pub. And my brain kind of goes, oh, have you taken your factor? And then I'm like, no, wait, don't have to do that now. And it does take time to adjust to. And I think that's only normal, right? You grow up your whole life with a condition where you're required to treat constantly. And then all of a sudden you don't have to do that. I think there is still that sort of muscle memory or that sort of trigger built into your brain where something happens and your immediate reaction is like, got to think about treatment, got to think about my hemophilia. And it's a nice problem to have, to adjust to such a different way of life. And, fingers crossed, long may it continue, but I understand that I did sign up to a clinical trial. There are no guarantees. And, we hope that gene therapy will last a significant amount of time, but we're only going to know if that's the case if we get the data and people sign up to trials. And I mean, it's obviously crazy to see within this past year now approval for hemophilia gene therapy for hemophilia A and hemophilia B. It all seems to have just suddenly arrived in one go. And I'm just baffled that it's 3 years ago I was sort of embarking on the trial. And I'm like, wow, like things, really do seem to be moving at this increasingly,
right?
exponential rate in development. But again, it all seems to be happening in hemophilia. And that gap between hemophilia and all the other bleeding disorders just feels like it's getting bigger.
Well, I know, and this is something that we hear all the time, and it's something that, we've talked about with Dr. Wilcox and stuff. The money is in hemophilia. It's easier to get approved for something, for a clinical trial with hemophilia than it is with one of these, ultra rares or something, because it's not necessarily, that risk factor, right? Like, okay, if we're going to throw millions of dollars into this and it doesn't work, like, okay, but what did we learn from this, really? So the fact that, you did your trial, or you're in the middle of your trial, but you started your trial 3 years ago. And now, just within the past 3 years, there's so many things that have been approved. I mean, you come from a very similar world as we do. To see that many things get approved in such a short amount of time is like the speed of light in this world, honestly, because we have a running joke. Oh, in just 10 years, we could have a cure. In just 10 years, we could have a cure. Like, it's, I looked at one of my mom's old interviews and she was like, I'm hoping that by the time Julia's 21, that we will have cured this thing. And, Julia's now 24, and it really is just kind of the approvals, the getting everything set. And now that the legwork has been done, hopefully that means everything else will speed up. And so, yes, it may seem weird that we're talking to you, a hemophiliac who went through gene therapy, but honestly, in order for gene therapy for Glanzmann's to happen, there has to be success in gene therapy for hemophilia. And so that's why it's so important to have these conversations, and also to get to know the rest of the bleeding disorder world as well, because it may not be the exact same thing, but your experiences are very similar to experiences within our own community. And I'm all for bringing new ideas, brainstorming, and meeting new people just to increase awareness for us and get the word out, I guess.
Yeah.
So with all of that said about gene therapy and how quickly it's moved just within the past couple of years, what do you think the future of bleeding disorders looks like?
I think it's going to be a lot more options. I think treatment options will increase massively. I think the main challenge is making sure that there are options for people who don't just have hemophilia or, standard hemophilia A without inhibitors. I think, we've seen a lot of development come along recently, and now people are almost somewhat spoilt for choice. I mean, I won't get into it now in terms of what patient choice really is, and it varies between countries and rules and insurers and payers in terms of what you actually get. But I think the community is in a good place to have more treatment options moving forwards. From my science background and also personally, I'm really hopeful about the idea of genetic medicines and gene therapies, and people would consider the gene therapy I had as sort of first generation gene therapy, and the technology is only going to improve and get better as time goes on. So I am hopeful that genetic medicines will offer treatment options to people where, maybe it won't technically be considered a cure, but you'll pretty much be able to live a life free of your symptoms for the most part. And you'll just have to have sort of treatment plans in place for those unexpected things in your life, whether it's surgery or, bad accident, for example. And I really do hope that genetic medicines, gene therapies are made available to people with other rare bleeding disorders and just other rare diseases in general. That's something that I sort of highlighted in the video, that ultimately I think gene therapy can have a much more meaningful difference and impact on people outside of hemophilia. And I really do hope to see that. But as you say, hemophilia, multi-billion-pound industry, and you've got investors left and right, all these companies, and it is where the money is, and that's why the research tends to get done there first. But hemophilia offers itself as a really useful petri dish, if you like, to kind of develop these medicines and hopefully then expand them out to other conditions that I would, hazard to say are perhaps more in need and more deserving than hemophilia. Not to say that people with hemophilia don't deserve the best treatments, but, if you've got access to all these other great treatments outside of gene therapy that exist, and you're, fortunate enough to be in a country that has access to them, you can live a pretty much near to normal life now. And, I come across parents and younger people with bleeding disorders, youth camps, and, just seeing people run around and do things that I was told definitely not to do when I was younger. And it just makes me realize that, wow, even in sort of 20 years, so much has changed. And I think things can only continue to improve as we move forwards, provided we all do our part as patient advocates and we make sure our voice is continuously heard throughout the development process. We have our say in those clinical programs, and that voice isn't lost. And we got to avoid that slippery slope of kind of becoming victims of our own success. If treatments get so good that it kind of normalizes people, there are other things that can kind of slip off the agenda that we need to make sure we catch those, and that, we have good treatments, but it can always be better. I think we always strive for excellence as much as we possibly can. And I think that's why things have gotten so good for people in the community over those last couple of decades.
We're huge advocates for that. Like, yes, you may have one medication or whatever, but that works for the majority of people within the community. But where are the options? What happens if it stops working? So we're huge advocates of that. Like, we want options. Give us all of the options.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you're joining us for our conference in July, right? I know Kate is, but are you coming as well?
Yes, perfect. I will be there. So if anyone listening in to this podcast is also going to be attending, then just look for me. And I know I've had gene therapy, but I don't have any extra arms or, a third eye that's developed. So it might not be obvious that I'm a genetically modified individual now.
Oh, this is where my dark humor comes in and be like, let's get a name tag calling you specimen number, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I like the worst member of the X-Men possible, right? What's your superpower? Oh, I bleed a lot. So
Well, last but not least, I ask this pretty much of everybody that we talk to. What would you say to your younger self, to the boy who was fighting the debilitating pain of a bleeding disorder every day? What would you say now to him?
To stick with it and, don't let it define you. Like, your hemophilia doesn't have to be the dominating thing in your life. There are so many things to look forward to. When I was younger, I didn't think I'd have so many connections in the community, and that, you're going to find people and connect with people that become lifelong friends, that, the reason you're friends with them isn't, down to you having hemophilia, but it started off as that initial connection, and, that it's an amazing community that you're actually lucky to be a part of. And that whilst as a little kid who was being told he couldn't do things, was heartbreaking at the time, that ultimately it's kind of water off the duck's back, as we say now, as I'm moving into being an adult. And I'd also say to him, football isn't the be all and end all. If I had a chance to go back to my younger self and tell him to get involved in more unique, like niche sports, that's what I would do. Because now I'm like too old and uncoordinated to figure out all these hobbies. And I'm always like, I wish I'd have done this sport when I was younger, instead of just hounding after football, desperate to be a goalkeeper at a mighty 5'10", thinking, it's not the hemophilia that held me back. It was my lack of talent and height. So, I'll blame it on the hemophilia, younger Luke. Get over it and focus on some other sports, and you might have actually made it as a sportsman somewhere else.
Well, if you're interested in Haemnet's Glanzmann's 360 survey and would like to participate, we are going to link it in the show notes. Luke, I am going to do a couple of news items, and then we will say goodbye to you. But first, I do want to thank you for doing this. Like I've mentioned multiple times throughout this, you stuck out to Peter and I. You're very easy to talk to. You're open, and it was something that we wanted to share with our community. So we're very lucky to have met you. So for our news items, registration is open for the 2023 GRF Educational Conference in Boston for this upcoming July. Applications for lodging grants are open until May 15th. And you can find more information. We've been updating it on the website, www.curegt.org. Also, if you or a family member has GT, definitely check out our support group on Facebook. It is a space for people with GT and caregivers or family members. That's pretty much all who's in that group. We try to keep it as private as possible so that it's a safe space for everybody. Luke, again, thank you.
No problem. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, hopefully I explained the sort of gene therapy stuff in an accessible way, because sometimes I look back over all those years and I go, actually, what did happen? So yeah, if anyone is curious, like you said, you'll put links to the video in the show. So questions, comments that people might have, like if they leave them on YouTube or Instagram or whatever it may be, I always do my best to get back to people and answer as well. So, don't be afraid to reach out if you do have any other questions.
And as always, please like and subscribe to this podcast. Leave a review if you feel so inclined. And remember that you may be one in a million, but you are not alone.